Thanks so much for joining us for this pop-up conversation with Congressman Steny Hoyer, who you all probably know and I've covered for a very long time. This morning we're going to be talking about news of the day, and there is more news of the day than I could even dream about, as well as diving deep on digital equity. A big thank you to Comcast for partnering with us to make this conversation happen. After my conversation with Mr. Hoyer, I'm going to be joined on stage by Broderick Johnson, EVP of Public Policy, and the EVP of Digital Equity at Comcast for a fireside chat. You can find Punchbowl News on all social media platforms at Punchbowl News, and we encourage you to share this conversation on all social media platforms. With that, I'd like to welcome Congressman Steny Hoyer to the stage. Okay.
Talk about the news of the day. That's a downer, huh?
Well, that's the business we're in, unfortunately. So let's talk, Mr. Hoyer, a couple things at the top. You've worked with Kevin McCarthy for a long time. I'd say you're one of the Democrats that has a good working relationship with McCarthy when you were majority leader and he was minority leader. If you have been reading Punchbowl News or any other news outlet over the last couple of weeks, he had a bunch of conservatives effectively hijack the floor, right? And suggest that the Republicans can't bring any legislation to the floor because of problems they had with the debt limit deal. Have you ever seen anything like this in your couple of years in Congress?
No. When you say like this, there were obviously, when we were in charge, we had an argument or discussions between some of our members about.
You never called them arguments. They were family discussions.
Family discussions, and we got to consensus. That's the difference. We ultimately always got to consensus, meaning that we didn't lose 4 votes on a rule. Right. That was the test. So I've never seen anything like this, but I've never seen a more willful, irresponsible group of people have a significant number of in a party. They're the significant minority, maybe 18, 20. There were 12 on the rule. So I haven't seen this in this kind of continuing way.
Now, the debt limit deal that passed a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, raised the debt limit until 2025, cut spending modestly a little bit, and had a bunch of other Republican policies. But inherent in this group's complaints, and you're an appropriator, so this is something you're going to have to deal with, is that Congress cut spending to below the agreed to amount that you guys all voted for in this debt limit deal, and cut spending back to 2022 levels. Kay Granger, the chair of the Appropriations Committee last night, said she would do that, I think, against her wishes, I think would be safe to say. What is the impact of that, both on the appropriations process and the eventual funding of the government, which has to be obviously a joint project with the Senate?
Well, as everybody has seen, the appropriation process has been a very difficult process for many years now. Yes. Where passing 12 appropriation bills in regular order on time has not happened. And we have repaired to these omnibuses, which are a alternative, but not a good alternative. And everybody agrees on that. But it is the go-to position because we haven't been able to get to do our work. Why? Because we haven't been able to create the kind of consensus that we need to create. We have a little problem, as you know, on the defense bill where we need Republican votes. They're going to need our votes on a whole number of bills, but they don't feel responsible. Why? Because they're the House of Representatives, yes, but they don't have the presidency and they don't have the Senate. When they had the presidency, of course, we passed the debt limit 3 times without much drama. Why? Because they felt they had responsibility. Now, they don't feel that they have responsibility, so this is much of a political game for their most radical supporters.
And on last question on this, look down the road a little bit. It's been many, many years since we passed 12 appropriations bills. I can't remember what year that was. How confident are you that Congress can avoid a government shutdown in September?
Given the players on the Republican side, not very confident. We've shut down the government before. They have shut down the government before. And they shut down the government as a policy, as a tactic, not as a, oh, this happened. They did it on purpose, feeling that that would put enough pressure to get their objectives. They ultimately, that didn't happen, but I'm not confident at all that we're going to be able to avoid a shutdown unless, and that's the key, you saw in the debt limit, there were over 300 responsible members who said, as Kevin McCarthy had said, default is not an option. If default were not an option, and you believe that default was not an option, then you deal in a world of alternatives, and the alternative was to vote for the debt limit, both on the rule, key, and on the bill itself. And what you saw ultimately was over 300 members of Congress sort of bit the bullet. This wasn't a perfect bill. There were a lot of people who disliked a number of things about it on both sides, from the right, from the left, and everybody in between. But it was the alternative that was available not to default, which 300 plus people felt was not an option.
Let's move into the topic of the day, which is digital equity. Just to set the stage, in the last Congress, in which you were the majority leader, and Democrats controlled all three branches of government.
Otherwise known as the good old days.
Maybe. Well, I was going to say maybe not according to Kevin McCarthy, but maybe according to Kevin McCarthy. You guys passed a lot of major pieces of legislation, but for our purposes, two pieces of legislation that play into the digital equity space: the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, two landmark pieces of legislation that the Democrats cleared. You know, the pandemic, I would say, put a finer point on the need for to close the digital equity gap. You had people working from home, including us much of the time, you some of the time. Kids were at home going to school. Universities were virtual. Middle schools, elementary schools, high schools. Parents were working from home. Set the stage for us. How do you frame that importance for digital equity for Americans in your district and across the country?
Well, to some degree, Jake, you just did it. We had a pandemic. The pandemic put us in a mode where we had never been before, essentially in our lifetimes, where you could not communicate in person. You did not aggregate people. You didn't go to work. You didn't go to school. You didn't go to community meetings. And therefore, it became necessary to utilize the technology that existed, but which most of us had not become very conversant with in a sophisticated sense. You know, I can't remember how many times I was on Zoom in a regular course of business before the pandemic. Not very often, some. And what we were confronted with was the reality that if you did not have the technology and you didn't know how to use the technology, you were shut out, which was bad for kids in school. It was bad for people who worked, and it was bad for people who wanted to converse with their families. So we had a reality that existed. Now, you mentioned two bills, the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction, but actually it was in the rescue plan where we had the first effort at digital equity. We recognized that, particularly because schools, I think that was probably the most stark example, that if you didn't have a computer, if you didn't have some sort of device on which you could communicate from afar, then you were shut out. The rest of us, the adults, could somewhat overcome that, but kids couldn't overcome it because you're only in the first grade for the most part once, and second grade twice, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you lose out at that period of time, you are very disadvantaged in our society. So that's where digital equity came in. The rescue plan, we started a program to try to offset the cost of that. And then in the infrastructure bill, we expanded that very substantially, not only in terms of subsidizing people to get, but to make sure that every neighborhood and every home had access to connectivity. And so in the infrastructure, we created this connectivity plan, both for the private sector services so that they could get to, and we gave grants to states and localities, et cetera, et cetera. That was critically important to make sure that we don't have 1 out of 5 Americans who were not connected shut out. Because if you cut out 20% of your people, your economy is going to suffer. And longer term, because they're shut out of education and healthcare. And healthcare also became a critical element because doctors started practicing from afar, virtually. And so
Which we still see now outside of the pandemic.
And it's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
You get a great doctor, he can serve or she can serve many more people virtually than she or he could in person.
You know, Maryland, your state, which you've represented for quite some time, is an interesting example of this for a lot of reasons, right? Because big cities, suburbs, small towns, and rural reaches, all in a relatively condensed area. I mean, what are you hearing from your constituents in your home state about the digital equity gap?
Well, one thing I want to say, because you said we all think the urban areas were connected. There were access deserts in Manhattan where people were not connected. So this was not just a rural question, although obviously a rural question specifically. In my state, I just had a meeting on this very digital divide and connectivity and reaching out to make sure, as the chair of the Regional Leadership Council that has been created by Jeffries and by Biden, who both sat down and said, look, we need to make sure all that work that we've done in these 5 or 6 extraordinary bills that invested in America, and I have an agenda called Make It in America I've been pursuing for 13 years, very much like what we have done in the last Congress, most productive Congress probably in which I've served, particularly as it related to reaching down and lifting up people who had been shut out. Because if you shut people out, they're not able to learn, they're not able to participate, they're not able to be constructive, positive citizens in our society. So in Maryland, we're pursuing it at the local level and at the state level. The governor is very concerned about making sure every Marylander is connected. Every Marylander has access and can afford. So it's not just access, you need to be able to afford to hook up.
And now let's talk about that, your role here, which is chairman of the Regional Leadership Council. So it's basically your job to get Democrats to not only talk about what they've done in the 2 years in which you were in the majority, the last 2 years, but to implement that and
right.
to get localities to implement it and get members to work with their localities to implement it. So talk about that role, and I think this is an outgrowth of some complaints in the past that you didn't do enough of talking about these things and enough touting these successes. So how are you doing that?
Well, everybody talks about Democrats getting out a message.
Not me.
One problem with getting out our message is we have a lot of messages because we do a lot of things, because we believe in investing in America. It's very simple when you say, I want smaller government, lower taxes. Hooray. And everybody in America agrees that until the hurricane strikes them. Then all of a sudden we need a big government, we need to invest in, hey, it's me you're worried about. So it's a little more complicated. So what we need to do, and what the Regional Council is designed to do, is first of all, identify. We did so much, you need to sort of digest and chew up and be able to talk about everything that we did, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, manufacturing, chips, science, environment. I mean, just so much investment that we made. Identify it. And then make sure we implement what we did. Make sure it gets, that's why I had that meeting last week about connectivity. I wanted to make sure the locals knew what we had, what they could avail themselves out, and the resources they had to get people connected in rural and every other area of our state. And once you identify, once you get it implemented, we have a map of black dots on a map, 32,000 programs in infrastructure in process. Not necessarily broken ground, but in process. Applications made, identified, et cetera, et cetera. But if you do not let people know that that resulted from work that we did, then they respond in a Washington Post poll, 62% of them said, well, they didn't do much. Now, those of you who are involved, and certainly those who cover, you may disagree what we did during the 117th Congress, but we did a hell of a lot of good for our country. You can argue, was it good or bad? And of course, some argue that we spent too much money. We'll see. But we made investments in making America better, which is what Biden said he wanted to do as he started his term. Generational change. And that's what we did. Regional Council is to make sure we know what we did, make sure that we implement what we did, and make sure that Americans know it. Clarence Long was the senior member of my delegation, Jake, when I went to Congress, of Charlie Wilson's war fame. And he brought, I went to his office, introduced myself. He knew who I was, but introduced me. He said, I want to tell you the secret of staying here, Steny. He said, do a lot for your people and tell them about it.
And I think you finally learned the lesson.
That's the deal.
Well, let's talk about some of this investment in broadband and in connectivity. The Affordable Connectivity Program subsidizes, in effect, broadband internet in the homes of more than 18 million people. 18 million families have signed up, but there are still tens of millions of more people eligible but not signed up.
Right.
I wonder what you think of, how you think you can, you've done a lot of good. You've gotten all these folks connected in the program. How do you get over that next hump and get the rest of these people signed up?
Good question, and that's that meeting I had ironically, the offices of the Southern Maryland Electric Co-op with all the community, Tri-County Council, three counties, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's County. I represent two other counties as well. But the purpose of that was to encourage them to continue identifying. The superintendent of schools was there in Charles County, and she spoke about how they identify every child in their school and do they have connectivity. And as a matter of fact, part of our program, we gave every kid a computer or a tablet. County commissioners in rural areas identify, and the cable companies, Comcast and other cable companies, identify who doesn't have cable. They have a business interest in wanting to get everybody connected. And to the extent that we help by investing in making that happen, I think everybody working together, public sector, county governments, city governments, municipalities, state, local governments, working together to identify, to make sure their people are connected.
Some of this funding, BEAD funding, which funds efforts to expand broadband to rural areas, is going to end soon. The funding is going to come dry. You have a bunch of funding running dry for not only broadband, but for other priorities. How do you get a Republican House to agree to fund, although, you guys make the argument that many Republican constituencies are affected by these coverage gaps, but, they have they tend to sometimes have a reflexive no when it comes to policies that you've passed.
Jake, let me tell you an interesting thing. I've gone back on the Appropriations Committee. I was on for 23 years. I'm back on now and set on the Labor Health Committee. And we had some hearings on the Labor Health Committee. I think they're, not sure, 12, 13 Republican members of the committee. And I noticed during the hearings, multiple hearings, they were talking about going back to fiscal year 22 numbers. And then as our witnesses, with one, maybe two exceptions on the committee, Mr. Harris being one of them, every one of the Republican members asked the witnesses, whatever their subject was, about something they needed in their district. While saying we want to go back to fiscal year 22 numbers, but by the way, said the chairman of our committee, I've got a lot of rural constituents and we need to make sure they're hooked up. My point, I think, as all of you can tell, is we need to cut spending, but somebody else's. Not the thing I think is important. Of course, Republicans think defense is very important. I share that view. But how do you convince Republicans? You make sure they understand the consequences and make sure their constituents understand the consequences of not funding access in this particular instance, health care, education, environment. Name your subject. There are, every one of them have constituents who care deeply about that and see the impact on their own lives. Look at the forest fires we're having, and I have a big bull roast every year around my birthday. About 1,200 people come.
And your birthday's this week, tomorrow.
You know, I knew this was going to be a vicious attack. I knew this was going to be, Broderick's, an exposure of my vulnerability.
We all have birthdays.
Yes.
I don't know what to tell you.
Right. I'm turning 118.
25 once again.
Yeah, right.
So this is the last question that I have for you, and it's a loaded one. The Affordable Connectivity Program's funding also expires early next year, and I guess the broad question that we always try to end these interviews on is, what more could Congress and government do in this area over the next couple of years?
Act rationally.
That's a high hill to climb for a lot of
It is
people.
a very high hill to climb. The House of Representatives being shut down by 20 people is not a rational way to run a country, much less a great and good country like the United States of America. The people of our country need to reject those who would, for their own reasons, for their egomaniacal reasons, seize from some 410 representatives of the American people the ability to act on behalf of America. This is a serious, serious question. It's a serious question for Leader McCarthy. My view is, again, the 400 need to take control and tell the 20 later for you, Mac, you do not represent the best interests of our country.
Mr. Hoyer, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank
being
you.
with you.
Good to be with you. Now, ladies.
They already cut you off. That's
Hello. Gee whiz. What I was going to say, Jake, is Schwanza Goff has now come in here.
Don't embarrass her.
She was, well, I already did, but she was my brain for such a long period of time, and without her, I'm having real trouble.
So you can't even find your office. But now we're going to welcome up Broderick Johnson, the EVP of Public Policy and the EVP of Digital Equity at Comcast, for a fireside chat.
Thank you. Hey, Jake. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I have to admit I'm biased.
Good morning.
Because Broderick is a former employee of the House of Representatives, which is for me, like, you know, the end-all, be-all. I don't even think we need the Senate. If we just stick with the House, we'll figure things out. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on that one.
That's
so
okay. I won't.
So let's start with this. Beginning tomorrow, the administration is embarking on the ACP Week of Action.
Yep.
Comcast is the founding partner of the Online for All initiative, which kind of explains itself. Online for All is online for all. Talk about what Comcast and what you are doing to raise awareness about digital equity.
Sure, but can I first, before Congressman Hoyer is gone, I want to just say happy birthday to him tomorrow. But I also want to note that, you know, I've been in D.C. and worked on the Hill and have had a chance over decades to watch Steny Hoyer and to learn from him, both in policy and process. And God bless him. He's a tremendous man and a fellow Marylander.
Yeah, he is. He probably knows, as we were discussing backstage, probably knows more about the history of the House, modern history of the House, than anybody around anymore. So, okay.
But to the ACP.
Yes,
right?
back to the ACP.
Right to the ACP. So, look, the ACP is a game changer for tens of millions of households, families, individuals across the United States. In the short period of time that the program has been in place, 18.5 million eligible households, including 200,000 in the state of Maryland, have signed up for this game-changing program to connect them. It's still early in the process. There are about 40 million more families to sign up to the ACP. Comcast is deeply committed to that. We have been committed to that. Really going back to 12 years ago when we started our Internet Essentials program, out of a commitment to make sure that those who could least afford to be online could get online. We've seen 10 million families be part of that. And so for us, the ACP is an opportunity for tens of millions more families to get connected to the internet for the first time. And again, it is a game-changing opportunity for them.
What do you hear? We talked about this with Mr. Hoyer a little bit, but what do you hear when you talk to Republicans about this? Is, you know, a lot of Republican constituencies benefit from this program.
Yes.
And because as we've seen the realignment of the country, Republicans represent a broad swath of rural America.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, obviously the mood right now is cut, but when you get into the specifics, as Mr. Hoyer said, it gets more difficult. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, so it as Mr. Hoyer said, it's very important to make sure that Republicans are aware of what the ACP, of what being online means for their constituents. And when you look at the numbers thus far on ACP signups, in a number of the reddest states in this country, you're seeing ACP signup numbers above the national average. It's important, therefore, that Republican lawmakers be aware of that, because there is a potential cliff. The ACP could run out of money early next year. That cannot happen. It cannot happen for people in urban America, cannot happen for people in rural America. But it's important that Republicans understand that and understand what's at stake for their constituents as well, and also to understand the benefits that the ACP is bringing to their constituents.
Right. It's not only just internet for surfing. It's internet for life, right? I mean, it's doctor's appointments, work, learning, all that stuff.
Absolutely. And it's also for what I'd call the joy of being online, right? It's not just, you know, about education. It's not just about telehealth. Those are very important things. But there are many people who go online. It's a form of entertainment. It's a form of exploration for them. It's a chance to connect to things that make them very happy.
So let's talk about rural for a minute, specifically. The infrastructure bill committed a record amount of money to broadband, and we talk about rural broadband a lot. I mean, how is the process of getting people in rural America going? How is the process of getting people connected?
Well, in many ways, the process of getting the BEAD money out is really just starting. $42 billion, plus $42.5 billion, I should say, is going out to states all across the United States to help connect rural America, to help connect unserved and underserved communities. Again, many of those are in rural America. But ACP awareness and continuation of ACP needs to go hand in hand with the deployment dollars that are going out there, because let's face it, we don't want to build broadband bridges to nowhere because people aren't signing up because they don't understand how important the ACP is for them.
Now, let's talk about the ACP specifically. The White House did not include a specific funding number for the ACP in its budget. Talk about that and talk about what should happen, what your view and Comcast's view is what should happen to that program.
Well, it's very clear. The ACP should continue, and the funding needs to be extended. And I believe the White House is being made very aware of that being, well, it's a priority for the administration. As Congressman Hoyer was saying, there are many things, when you look back at what's happened in the first 2 years of this administration, that should be talked about and heralded for the difference it's making in people's lives. ACP is among those things. It needs to be continued. Imagine telling a family that for the first time has been connected to the internet through the ACP, using that to get an Internet Essentials program through Comcast. Sometime next year, the money is run out. It's unimaginable, and I don't think that's where we will end up. So it's important, though, that people understand what could happen if it's not funded.
We talk about for a second senior citizens. There are certain populations of people, senior citizens included, who are at risk of being left out of, I hate to say this, but modern society of the connected digital world.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, you know, I in my job, I get to go all across the country and to talk about the importance of the internet, the importance of ACP. Been to a number of senior centers, senior citizen centers across the country, and the magic that happens in these centers. For example, in Detroit, there's a center called the St. Patrick's Senior Center. It's been serving seniors in Detroit for several decades. You go there now and you will see teens, digital navigators, working with the seniors in those centers to help them learn about how to get online, how to get a device, how to use the device, how to make telehealth appointments, and also, again, how they can get the joy of being online to help enhance their lives. Seen that in Detroit, also seen that in Houston. One of the things that I remember most about last year is being in Houston at a senior center and meeting a gentleman, 90-year-old gentleman who was online. He had an ACP voucher that helped him get online. He was learning how to use the internet, and the smile on his face as he talked to me about how being able to get episodes of Gunsmoke, his favorite. How many people here know what Gunsmoke was?
I know what it is, but
okay, right.
I don't
like
think
three hands go up. Gunsmoke.
I don't think we're in a Gunsmoke crowd, but
anyway, it was an old Western show. And he also would watch reruns of the Houston Astros when they were winning all the time, and they've been doing that again too. If you met this gentleman, you wouldn't have booed him.
Okay,
I just
fine.
like that, right?
But I just boo the Astros as a general.
But there's this misconception that seniors are intimidated about being online. They don't want to be online. That is absolutely not the case.
Talk about your work with local leaders. I mean, what do you find when you talk to local leaders, just about the awareness situation when it comes to getting communities and cities and municipalities online?
I would say it's in these local communities where the rubber hits the road. People in these local communities, especially the community partners we work with, people that run digital navigator organizations that help people become aware of how to get online, how to use a device, what the relevance is to their lives, they understand and they help communicate to us what matters the most. And I'd mentioned a couple times digital navigators. We do a lot of work with digital navigators. These are people really who are very well respected in their local communities. So when they knock on your door and say, hey, Jake, you don't have an internet connection, I can help you get one. These are the folks that can help convince people that they can be trusted to do that.
And just talk about that for 1 second. I mean, what are the big challenges to getting people online?
Well, because we at Comcast, I get so animated about this because it really matters so much.
Yep.
And you look at the barriers to people getting online, and they are among things that, we see in many other contexts. Distrust for business, government, a lack of a device. What good is having internet access if you don't have a device? A lack of awareness about how to use that device and the relevance of that device, right? I mean, why go through all the process of getting online, registering for ACP, buying internet essentials with your voucher if you don't know what to do with it? You don't know what difference it makes in your life. So these are all the barriers that are being broken down as a result of the advocacy that's going on between government and the private sector. One
last question. We are quickly running out of time. What else? I mean, I'm sure Comcast has a lot of priorities, but in this space, what else do you hope that Congress and the administration do?
We talk a lot about once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. You talk about that in sports, like University of Michigan, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to win a national championship.
Well, listen, the Connecticut
people that work with me know I had to drop that reference in.
The University of Connecticut Huskies, my home state, had 5 times in a lifetime opportunity.
Right. But so you're basketball though. So we talk about once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, but really with this ACP program and the BEAD program and the efforts of companies like Comcast, it really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'd worked in the Clinton administration back in '98. We used to talk about the digital divide. The president would give speeches. Back then, the goal was, listen to this, a computer in every classroom.
Crazy.
Now we know it's about a computer and a home connection in every household. We can achieve that. And because of the massive amount of money that Congress, working with the administration, has put out there, we know that this can truly be a game-changing, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for families all across this country.
Crazy how far we've gone in just 25 years, right?
It is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, Broderick, we are unfortunately out of time. Thanks so much for joining me. I mean, we could keep going, but I think they might just
talk later.
They'll carry the stage with us on out of it.
There's a lot to say.
A big thank you to Congressman
Jake.
Steny Hoyer and his staff, as well as Comcast, for partnering with us to make this event possible. We have many, many, many more events coming up. Thursday, Heather Cagle, my colleague, interviews Congressman John Joyce, Republican of Pennsylvania, about the future of cancer research after the IRA. You can RSVP for that and more at our events hub at punchbowl.news. Have a great day and stay safe.